47 minutes, not 20, not 30, 47 minutes. That is the number that experienced investigators keep coming back to when they analyze what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona in the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026. 47 minutes of documented presence at a residential property in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors were asleep, where the streets were empty, where a single wrong move could have changed everything. 47 minutes of operational execution in the dark by someone who never seemed to panic, never seemed to rush, never seemed to make the kind of mistake that pressure produces in people who are not prepared for what they are doing. 47 minutes that tell investigators something specific, something behavioral, something that narrows the profile of who did this in ways that are more significant than they might initially appear when you just see the number written on a page. And here is what makes that number matter beyond its face value. In the confirmed timeline of this case, the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's property went offline at 1:47 in the morning. The pacemaker monitoring system connected to Nancy's cardiac device went dark at 2:28. That is a window of 41 confirmed minutes between those two documented events. Former detective and state trooper Morgan Wright, speaking on Brian Anton Investigates on News Nation on March 19th, extended that operational window to between 40 and 47 minutes total on the property. 47 minutes. For most criminals, the instinct is the exact opposite of that. Get in, accomplish the objective, get out before discovery becomes possible. Every additional minute spent at the scene of a serious crime in a residential neighborhood is a minute in which a neighbor could wake up. A car could drive past, a light could turn on in a window across the street. The operational logic of criminal behavior in residential settings, documented across thousands of cases, points consistently toward speed, toward minimizing exposure, toward leaving before the window of discovery opens any wider than it has to. A suspect who spends 47 minutes at the scene of an abduction either required that time to accomplish their objective, or was comfortable enough with their surroundings that the urgency to leave quickly simply did not apply to them the way it applies to someone operating in unfamiliar territory. Wright's assessment, based on his review of available evidence and consultation with sources on the ground in Tucson, points toward the latter, and that comfort, that extended operational confidence sustained over nearly an hour in the dark at someone else's property, is the behavioral signature of someone who knew exactly where they were, exactly how that neighborhood moved at that hour, and exactly how safe they were in that specific place at that specific time of the morning. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of NBC Today Show anchor Savannah Guthrie. She was taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson in the early morning hours of February 1st, 2026. Before she became a case number, before she became a federal investigation, before she became the subject of wall-to-wall media coverage and a $1.2 million reward, and a task force of hundreds of federal and local investigators working from the FBI's Phoenix field office. She was a woman who raised children who love her, a woman who was active in her community, active in her faith, a woman who worked at a Wendy's and knew her neighbors and had built a life in Tucson that was ordinary in the best possible sense of that word. She was home in her own bed, in her own house, on an ordinary Friday night. She had left her daughter's home after dinner at approximately 9:48 in the evening, made the drive back to the Catalina Foothills, returned to her own property, and had the rest of the night ahead of her. And someone who had been to her property before, who had stood outside it 3 weeks earlier and looked at it and assessed it and left with a plan, came to her door at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st and took her. That is who this investigation is about. That is who the evidence assembled over 49 days is working to bring home. Every number in this analysis, every forensic result, every frame of surveillance footage, every tip processed by the task force, every hour worked by every investigator assigned to this case exists because of that woman. And understanding the evidence means never losing sight of that. If you want to follow cases like this with the depth and precision that mainstream media does not provide, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Here on this channel, we do not speculate. We examine documented evidence, confirmed official statements, and the patterns that experienced investigators recognize even when the public has not yet caught up. New cases and updates every week. And leave a comment before you keep watching. Do you believe the sheriff when he says he has known the motive since day one? Tell me why or why not, because that specific claim sits at the center of everything we are going to examine today, and understanding why it matters requires understanding the rest of the picture first. Now, let's talk about the road layout. Because Morgan Wright's geographical analysis is not just an interesting local detail about Tucson. It is an investigative tool that narrows the suspect pool in ways that are more significant than they might initially appear. Understanding exactly why requires understanding what the Catalina Foothills actually looks like from the perspective of someone trying to navigate it in the middle of the night with an operational plan to execute and no margin for confusion. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood where Nancy Guthrie lived is not a standard American residential grid. There is no orderly pattern of streets running north, south, east, and west that a stranger could navigate intuitively in the dark, making logical turns based on a general sense of direction and a rough mental map of where they need to go. Wright described the road system in terms that experienced investigators immediately understand as investigatively significant. He called it the equivalent of taking a bowl of spaghetti and turning it upside down. No rhyme, no reason, no pattern that yields to logic or intuition. A winding, irregular, complex network of roads that does not reward guesswork and does not forgive mistakes made in the dark at 2 in the morning while carrying out a serious crime. To navigate those roads successfully under those conditions requires one of two things. Either the suspect used a navigation application on a device, which would create a digital record that investigators could potentially recover through device. Forensics or telecommunications data requests submitted to the relevant carriers, or the suspect had prior personal familiarity with the specific road layout, not familiarity from a map, not familiarity from a single visit, familiarity developed through repeated presence over a period of time sufficient to allow those roads to become internalized knowledge. The kind of knowledge you carry in your body rather than in your phone. The kind of knowledge that lets you make a turn without thinking about it because you have made that turn before and your instincts already know where it leads. Wright's assessment, informed by his review of the available evidence and his conversations with sources in Tucson who have direct knowledge of the investigation's direction, is that the suspect navigated the Catalina Foothills with a level of comfort that points toward exactly that kind of local knowledge. His conclusion aligned with reporting from Brian Anton, who has been on this case since the beginning and whose source network in Tucson has consistently produced accurate information ahead of public confirmation, is that this person is not far from Nancy's neighborhood. Almost certainly did not come from another state. Almost certainly did not drive to Tucson from a distant location for the purpose of this crime and then drive back into anonymity afterward. This is not casual analysis offered without professional grounding. This is a former detective and state trooper narrowing the geographic profile of a suspect from the general population of the Tucson metropolitan area to a much more specific and investigatively useful subset. People whose relationship to the Catalina Foothills is personal enough, regular enough, and sustained enough to have generated the kind of internalized road knowledge that Wright identified as a defining characteristic of whoever was on Nancy Guthrie's property during those 47 minutes on the night of February 1st. But the problems with any theory of a random or geographically distant suspect do not stop there. Here is where the investigation gets specific in a way that changes the entire analytical picture. On January 11th, 3 weeks before the abduction, the suspect came to Nancy Guthrie's property. This is not a theory offered by a commentator working from incomplete information. This is confirmed by federal law enforcement sources with direct knowledge of the investigation. The suspect navigated those spaghetti roads on January 11th to get to Nancy's property. They observed it. They assessed the layout, the approach, the sight lines, the security features, the doorbell camera that would later be their first target on February 1st. They left without incident. And then they spent 3 weeks with what they had seen. 3 weeks of preparation. 3 weeks of acquiring the equipment that was later purchased at a Walmart and documented in the purchase records that investigators have been examining. 3 weeks of developing and refining an operational plan specific to that property and that target. And then, on February 1st, they came back. They navigated those same roads again in the dark. This time without reconnaissance as the objective. This time with execution as the objective. The January 11th visit is not incidental background detail. It is the reconnaissance phase of a premeditated, targeted abduction that was planned with a specificity and a deliberateness that investigators recognized immediately. And the fact that the suspect successfully returned to the same property 3 weeks later, navigated the same complex road system without apparent confusion, and then spent 4 to 7 minutes executing a plan at that specific address, is the behavioral signature of someone for whom the Catalina Foothills was not territory to be discovered but territory already understood. 47 minutes on the property. Confirmed reconnaissance 3 weeks earlier. Equipment purchased in advance at a traceable commercial retailer with records investigators have been examining for weeks. That combination does not describe a crime of opportunity. It does not describe a crime of impulse. It describes a crime of sustained and deliberate planning executed by someone who had a reason specific and powerful enough to drive that level of preparation. And that reason is what brings us to the element that the sheriff of Pima County identified from the very first morning of this investigation. Ce motive. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nonos has stated it clearly, publicly, and without qualification. He has known the motive in the Nancy Guthrie case since day one. Not a working theory he is continuing to develop. Not a probable explanation he is still working to confirm. A conclusion drawn from the crime scene evidence on the morning of February 1st and held consistently through 49 days of investigation without revision or retraction. Sheriff Nonos has also confirmed that this was a targeted crime. Nancy Guthrie was not selected randomly from the population of Tucson by someone with no connection to her. She was selected for a specific reason by a specific person who had a specific connection to her that was visible in the way the crime was carried out and in what the crime scene told investigators about the relationship between the perpetrator and the target. That is what targeted means in the operational language of experienced investigators. The crime scene did not just tell investigators that a crime had occurred. It told them why. It told them enough about the motive on the first morning to give the sheriff a conclusion he has held for 49 days without needing to revise it as new evidence came in, because the new evidence has been consistent with that conclusion, not contradictory to it. Former FBI forensic agent Tom Myers, a senior-level professional whose career included major federal investigations requiring exactly the kind of forensic discipline this case demands, described the investigative picture in terms that are worth sitting with for a moment. If this is 5-card stud, 7-card stud, the investigators have all the cards. Every piece of forensic evidence collected from the scene. Every surveillance frame analyzed from the Ring cameras and from neighbor footage requested on January 24th. Every confirmed lead generated from the more than 1,500 tips received after the reward was increased to $1.2 million. Every result, partial or complete, from the DNA analysis being conducted at a private laboratory in Florida. The task force holds all of it, and they are not showing it publicly because showing it would give the suspect precise information about exactly how close the investigation has come to them. Every detail disclosed publicly is a detail the suspect can use to calibrate their own response. Every confirmed investigative conclusion is information that could prompt the suspect to take steps that compromise the prosecution. The silence of the Pima County Sheriff's Office, no press conferences in over a month, significantly reduced daily media updates, is not the silence of an investigation that has stalled. It is the disciplined information management of an investigation that is protecting something being built toward a specific and imminent conclusion. And then the forensic picture adds a layer that no genuinely random crime can explain away. The suspect left biological evidence at the scene despite wearing gloves and a mask. This is not speculation or inference. Forensic expert April Stonehouse of Arizona State University confirmed publicly that biological traces from the suspect are scientifically expected to be present and recoverable from Nancy Guthrie's property despite the use of those precautions. That evidence was collected and sent to a private laboratory in Florida for analysis. The analysis has been ongoing. The DNA profile that investigators are developing from that biological material has not produced a direct match in CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index system that holds profiles collected from individuals with prior criminal records requiring DNA submission. Former FBI Special Agent Johnny Grusing, speaking to the U.S. Sun, assessed this CODIS result not as a dead end, but as a specific piece of information about the suspect. His conclusion is that this may be the suspect's first time committing a crime of this nature. Investigators have not identified a pattern of prior similar offenses connecting to this suspect. No known history of abduction. No similar crimes in any jurisdiction that link back to the same behavioral profile. The absence of a CODIS match is consistent with a suspect who has no prior criminal record that would have generated a DNA profile in the national database. And that absence tells investigators something specific and useful. It tells them that whoever took Nancy Guthrie has not previously been through a criminal proceeding that required DNA collection, which means no escalating history of prior convictions building toward this. Which means a suspect whose criminal action in this case is driven not by a general pattern of predatory behavior but by a specific, personal, targeted motivation powerful enough to generate, in a first offense, the kind of planning and operational discipline that many experienced criminals never achieve. The behavioral profile that emerges from combining Wright's geographical analysis, Grusing's investigative framework, Myers's forensic assessment, and the confirmed timeline of the crime itself is the most analytically specific picture of the suspect that the public record currently supports. For core characteristics define this profile based entirely on what the documented evidence shows. The first characteristic is premeditation sustained over an extended period. The January 11th reconnaissance visit, confirmed by federal law enforcement sources, establishes that the suspect identified the target, traveled to the property, assessed it in person, and then spent 3 weeks developing and preparing an operational plan before returning to execute it on February 1st. Extended premeditation of this kind is not the behavior of someone driven by impulse or reactive emotion. It is the behavior of someone who approaches a complex objective methodically. Someone willing to invest time, travel, observation, planning, and material preparation in achieving a specific goal. The gap between January 11th and February 1st is not a gap of hesitation. It is a gap of preparation. The second characteristic is operational discipline during execution. 47 minutes at a residential property in the early morning hours of a winter night in a neighborhood with sleeping residents nearby, executing an operation that involved disabling a doorbell camera at the outset, potentially disrupting the broader electronic infrastructure of the surrounding block, and carrying out the physical abduction of an 84-year-old woman without generating the kind of noise or disturbance that would wake a neighbor, trigger a motion-activated light visible to the street, or produce any response from the surrounding community. That level of composure, sustained over that duration of time, at that level of criminal exposure and personal risk, is not a common behavioral characteristic. It is the signature of someone who mentally prepared for what they were doing with enough thoroughness that the execution did not produce the kind of panic or mistake that pressure generates in people who are not ready for what they have committed to. The third characteristic is systematic knowledge management. The suspect knew about the doorbell camera before they arrived on February 1st and took specific action to defeat it as the first step of the operation. They may have known about the electronic infrastructure of the wider neighborhood and taken steps in advance to limit the digital record of their presence. They knew the road system well enough to navigate it in the dark efficiently both in January and in February. They knew the property well enough to accomplish their complete objective within 47 minutes on their second visit. The systematic acquisition and deliberate application of specific advanced knowledge, the kind of knowledge that requires intentional research and direct observation rather than casual familiarity, is a behavioral signature that separates this crime from impulsive or opportunistic acts and places it firmly in the category of planned, targeted violence. The fourth characteristic is the absence of a documented prior criminal pattern consistent with this level of sophistication. Gruesing's first-time offender assessment, consistent with the absence of a CODIS match and the absence of similar prior crimes in the investigative record, suggests that the suspect did not develop this operational capability through a history of escalating lesser offenses. They arrived at a crime of this complexity not because they had done it before, but because they had a motivation powerful enough to generate the planning, capacity, and execution discipline that this operation required. That is an unusual combination. And it is exactly the combination that points back, again, to the sheriff's day one conclusion. A specific, personal, targeted reason that made this crime feel not just possible to the suspect, but necessary. Now let's examine what investigators are doing with that profile across 49 days of continuous active work, because the operational methodology being applied to this case is as analytically significant as the evidence itself. Former FBI Special Agent Gruesing's investigative framework describes the methodology directly. If he were the assigned investigator, he would be studying Nancy, her life, her movements, her daily and weekly routines, her community connections, her professional and personal relationships, her history in Tucson, the full landscape of people who had reason to know her, know where she lived, know her schedule, and know the layout of the neighborhood where she had built her life. The question that framework works backward from is not just what happened on February 1st, but what intersection between Nancy's world and the suspect's world produced both the specific awareness of her existence and the specific motivation to target her in particular. In targeted crimes, the victim's life is the map that leads to the perpetrator. Every interview with Nancy's friends, neighbors, service providers, and community connections, every review of her financial records, her communications, her calendar, Every examination of the network of people who had regular presence in or regular knowledge of the Catalina Foothills area and who also had some connection to Nancy Guthrie, all of it is oriented toward the same convergent question. What about Nancy Guthrie's life connects to the person who came to her door at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st with equipment from Walmart and a plan developed over 3 weeks? The sheriff says he has known the answer since the first morning. 49 days of investigation have not required him to revise that answer. What connects the local knowledge profile to the targeted crime assessment creates the most specific and actionable investigative picture that the public record currently supports. A crime that was targeted for a specific personal reason and executed by someone with genuine local geographical familiarity does not just narrow the suspect pool by 2 independent variables. It narrows it by the intersection of those 2 variables. The person who took Nancy was not just someone who happened to know those roads. They were someone whose familiarity with that specific neighborhood was connected, in some direct and traceable way, to their awareness of Nancy's existence, her routine, her property, and her vulnerability at that particular hour on that particular night. The January 11th visit established that the suspect had identified her and her property specifically 3 weeks in advance. The geographical analysis establishes that the suspect had operational comfort in the area that goes beyond a single reconnaissance visit. The motive assessment establishes that there is a specific reason the suspect chose Nancy Guthrie and not someone else in that neighborhood or in that city. Put those 3 elements together in the same investigative frame and the suspect profile has characteristics concrete enough to distinguish a specific individual from the broader population of Tucson in ways that direct investigative resources toward a manageable set of candidates. Here is the complete picture at 49 days, assembled from every confirmed element in the public record and every assessment from experienced former law enforcement professionals who have reviewed that record with the analytical tools their careers gave them. The suspect is believed to be local, with knowledge of the Catalina Foothills road system sufficient to navigate it efficiently in the dark, and comfortable enough with the area to spend 47 minutes at the scene without the urgency a stranger would feel. The suspect conducted a confirmed reconnaissance visit on January 11th, 3 weeks before the abduction, and returned on February 1st with equipment purchased at Walmart and an operational plan developed in the interval. The suspect is likely a first-time offender in crimes of this type, consistent with the CODIS result and the absence of a documented pattern of similar prior offenses in the investigative record. The motive has been known to the sheriff since day one, a specific and targeted reason embedded in the crime scene evidence and consistent with the investigative direction maintained without revision for 49 days. The DNA analysis continues at a private laboratory in Florida with biological evidence confirmed present and scientifically expected to be recoverable. The Walmart purchase records connect the equipment used in the crime to a specific commercial transaction with documentation that investigators have been working to match to a specific individual. The task force operates in disciplined operational silence from the FBI's Phoenix field office, a posture consistent with prosecution preparation rather than investigative stagnation, and multiple independent former law enforcement professionals with no access to the non-public evidence that investigators have separately assessed this case as one that will be resolved, with one predicting that the outcome will surprise people when it becomes public. Former investigator Michael Gould said people will be surprised by the outcome. Former FBI agent Johnny Grusing said the suspect is dangerous and must be apprehended, that no one in the community can be considered safe until they are caught. Former FBI forensic agent Tom Myers said the investigators have all the cards. And former Detective Morgan Wright said the suspect knew every road or detail set when you understand its investigative implications fully. Tells you exactly where the investigation needs to look to find the person who took Nancy Guthrie. The case is not cold. It is not stalled. It is in the phase that precedes resolution, the phase where 49 days of assembled, processed, and cross-referenced evidence is being converted piece by piece into the prosecutable federal case that will support an arrest and sustain a conviction through trial. Resolution in a case of this complexity does not happen all at once. It happens through the sequential completion of investigative steps that each bring the case closer to the threshold where action is not just warranted but sustainable. The DNA analysis must be completed and must produce a profile that can be matched against a candidate. The Walmart purchase records review must confirm an identification tied to a specific individual whose name can then be run against every other evidence channel simultaneously. The January 11th footage analysis must extract every investigative implication from the visual record of the suspect's reconnaissance visit. The tips from the reward increase must be fully processed and the most credible ones pursued through the complete forensic comparison. Each of these steps is ongoing. Each is being worked by investigators who have been focused on this specific case and nothing else for 49 days. There is one more dimension of this picture that the 49-day mark makes newly visible and that has not received the analytical attention it deserves in the broader public discussion of this case. The question of what the suspect has been doing since February 1st and what the behavioral evidence of those 49 days means for the investigation's ability to eventually identify and locate them. A person who commits a crime of this planning complexity and this public visibility does not simply return to their normal life unchanged. The awareness that a massive federal investigation is actively pursuing them. The constant presence of this case in national media coverage for nearly 7 weeks. The knowledge that a $1.2 million reward has been offered for information leading to their identification. And that this reward can be claimed anonymously in cash by anyone, including people in their own social circle. All of these factors create a specific and sustained psychological and behavioral pressure. People who commit serious crimes and then attempt to maintain the appearance of normal life typically exhibit behavioral changes that people in their immediate social environment can sometimes detect even without fully understanding what they are seeing. Unusual anxiety that cannot be explained by events in that person's visible life. Changes in daily routine that do not have an obvious external cause. Unexpected and disproportionate attention to news coverage of a specific case. Unexplained changes in financial behavior or in patterns of movement and communication. The specific kind of hypervigilance that manifests in people who know that something is looking for them and that they cannot be certain how close it has come. These behavioral markers are exactly what the tip processing operation running alongside the forensic investigation is designed to surface. The 1,500 tips received after the reward increase represent a significant volume of exactly this kind of observational information from people in the Tucson community who may have noticed something unusual in someone they know in the weeks since February 1st. A tip that names a specific individual does not stand alone as evidence, but it provides something the comprehensive forensic picture currently lacks, a specific name to test against everything that has already been assembled. That name can be compared against the physical description captured in the doorbell camera footage before the camera was disabled. The height, the build, the partial facial features visible beneath the mask and hood. It can be compared against the DNA profile being developed from the biological evidence at the Florida laboratory. It can be compared against the vehicle records associated with that individual and the Ring camera footage showing a vehicle near the property. It can be compared against location data from the period surrounding the crime. Tips convert into identifications not by standing alone but by directing the full weight of the assembled forensic picture toward a specific candidate. And that candidate's name may already be in the processing queue. The reward picture adds the final analytical layer, $1 million from the Guthrie family, $100,000 from the FBI, $100,000 from a Tucson crime hotline, $1.2 million total, payable anonymously in cash to anyone with information that leads to the identification and arrest of the person responsible. Savannah Guthrie said it directly in her February 24th video. If you have been waiting and you have not been sure, let this be your sign. Former investigator Gould noted that tips in cases like this can come from anyone. Someone currently incarcerated who heard something, a relative of the suspect, a romantic partner who has been processing unusual behavior since early February, even someone who was tangentially involved and is now sitting with that knowledge weighing what it is worth to come forward against what it costs to stay silent. The suspect, if Grusing's first-time offender assessment is correct, has a social circle that has been processing something unusual since February 1st. People close to someone who commits a crime of this scale and this public attention do not always immediately understand what they witnessed or what it meant. But 49 days of sustained reflection, combined with wall-to-wall media coverage and a $1.2 million anonymous cash reward, creates conditions in which that reflection eventually produces a decision to make a call. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 49 days. She is 84 years old. She requires daily medication. She was taken from her home by someone who knew where she lived, knew how to navigate to her door in the dark, knew how to spend 47 minutes at her property without being detected, and left before the sun came up. That person is still publicly unidentified, but the investigation that has been pursuing them for 49 days is not running out of evidence. It is not running out of resources. It is not running out of experienced investigators committed to seeing this through. The DNA is present and scientifically expected to be recoverable. The purchase records exist and connect the equipment to a traceable transaction. The footage from January 11th is being fully analyzed. The tips continue to be processed and cross-referenced. The profile is established, specific, and increasingly narrow. And the task force operating in disciplined silence from the FBI's Phoenix Field office is protecting something that is being built toward a specific conclusion at a specific name. When that conclusion is reached, when the DNA profile matches a candidate, when the purchase record confirms a transaction linked to a specific individual, when the footage from January 11th yields the visual confirmation that directs everything else toward a specific person, the silence that has characterized this investigation for the past month will break in the way that 49 days of systematic federal work have been building toward. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, about anyone in the Catalina Foothills area with unusual familiarity with that neighborhood, about any vehicle observed near Nancy's home in the weeks before February 1st, or about anyone who expressed unusual interest in Nancy Guthrie or her family before or after February 1st, please contact the FBI at 1-800 Call FBI or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. Tips can be submitted anonymously. The reward is $1.2 million payable in cash. Every call matters. Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found. Her family deserves answers. And the case that experienced investigators believe is about to break deserves to be covered with the same depth and precision that every development in it has warranted since the first morning. Stay subscribed. Give this video a like. Share it with everyone who is following this investigation. The moment the next development breaks, we will be here. Thank you for watching.